Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bay Area Focus. I'm your host, Michelle Griego. Today, we have everything from colorful flowers to inspirational authors. And starting us off today is a returning guest. Her work often draws on the political and cultural landscape, and her new gripping book, The Book of Edda, is no different. Author Meg Ellison is at our table to discuss. Thanks for coming back to the show.
Thanks for having me back, Michelle.
We always love having you. So tell us about The Book of Edda. Does it pick up where your last book left off, The Book of the Unnamed Midwife?
So Edda picks up about 100 years after the end of the Unnamed Midwife.
Okay.
And the idea that I had was I wanted Edda to live in a civilization that had modeled itself after the midwife and her work and her journals.
Okay.
So I took a big break in between.
Okay. So you don't necessarily have to read the first book to read The Book of Edda.
You don't.
But you should.
It's better if you do. It's definitely a richer experience, but I've heard from people who've only read the second book, and it's been a different but great experience for them too.
Okay, tell me about Edda.
So Edda's a very unusual character. They're a gender fluid character, so when they're at home, they're Edda, and when they're out on the road, small spoiler alert, they're Eddie. It's a two-part character in one.
Okay, so it's like a trans character.
Eddie could definitely be called trans or gender fluid, depending on how you read it.
Okay, and this is during the apocalypse or after? Or
this
what?
is deeply post-apocalypse. So the apocalypse happened to the midwife, and now Edda is living in the long aftermath.
Okay, so how did you come up with this idea?
I've read a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction. I pretty much cleaned out the canon in English, and almost all of them are written by men, and almost all of the main characters are men. So in these books, there are no characters who are women, there are no characters who have biologically different needs from men, and I thought there was just this huge gap on the shelf where books ought to be. So I thought I should write those books.
Sure.
So I was thinking about queer people in the apocalypse, about poor people in the apocalypse, about people who start off without a bunker and without a stockpile of weapons, who have only their grit and their wits to get by on.
And what kind of journey does Edda or Eddie go through?
Eddie has a smaller geographic area than the midwife because he was born in a much smaller place and has a much smaller accommodation of where he can go, but he's also up against greater odds. In the world that has developed since the midwife's time, there are a lot of tin pot dictators. There are a lot of men who've been able to seize power and create small strongholds and fiefdoms, and most importantly, harems. So when Eddie looks at a landscape of slavers and slaves, they're looking at something very different than what the midwife saw, and so their fight is much harder and much more personal.
And their home is called Nowhere.
It's a place called Nowhere. It's in southern Missouri. For anybody who knows Missouri, it's where Fort Leonard Wood is now.
Okay.
And it's very close to the still existing metropolis of St. Louis, which is not a nice place.
Okay, so Edda is in Nowhere.
Yes.
But then outside of Nowhere,
there are lots of different pockets of civilization. There are religious groups that have held together. There are cities like St. Louis that still have commerce. There are places like Jefferson City where they've developed trades that are very important for the surrounding areas. Each place has found a way to survive, and they've done it very differently than the places around them.
But she's Edda in Nowhere, and outside of Nowhere, she's Eddie.
That's right.
Or he's Eddie.
He's Eddie.
Okay, so what is that, self-preservation? Is that self-expression? What is it?
It's both. It starts off as a type of preservation because, as we learned from the midwife's journals, it's much safer to be a man on the road than it is to be obviously a woman on the road. And then Eddie finds something in himself that has always existed that belongs in that personage. So Edda is Edda, Eddie is Eddie. They're both true, and they both have to live.
Well, you are, you know, you're more than an author and a sci-fi enthusiast. You are also a political activist. I mean, you get really involved, and you really want to talk about, I remember this from our last interview, you really want to talk about LGBTQ issues.
Absolutely. I mean, at this point in our history, I think everybody is a political activist. Everybody is involved on one side or the other of the political fence in trying to make things better for the people around them. And for me, that's women's rights, reproductive justice, and of course, LGBTQ quilt bag issues, because they're often some of the most dangerous, endangered, and marginalized people. So when there are big regime changes or when the rug gets pulled up from under society, they'll be some of the worst to suffer and the first to suffer.
You know, you mentioned reproductive rights. We know our new Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch says that he respects the precedent regarding Roe v. Wade, giving women, you know, hope that he can actively work through all of this. But what do you think?
I don't believe that for a second.
Okay.
I think if Gorsuch had a button in his hand that said end all abortion in America, he'd hit it with a smile on his face. I think that he and a lot of other conservative politicians are very carefully hedging their bets, knowing that they cannot carry most of the vote if they restrict the rights of women in any state. And if that means rolling back abortion where they can and keeping it technically federally legal, that's what they'll do. Gorsuch is not on our side.
Okay. And what do you think it means for women now that the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, which it's called, it's here to stay? At least for a year, at least we know that.
For now.
Some people are happy about that, but then some people were looking forward to some changes as well. What does that mean?
A lot of people were looking for changes in what things cost, and it's time that we own up as a nation to the idea that healthcare costs money, that it's a collective risk pool, that it costs all of us, and that we are all responsible to each other. I've always given advice that women should look to as much long-term birth control as they can possibly muster. If you can get a long-term IUD, or if you can handle hormonal birth control, whatever works for you, but you can't count on things necessarily being available next year. So a lot of people have taken that into their own hands and started stockpiling or going for a more long-term option.
Okay, well, it's always interesting when you come along, and the Book of Etta, good luck with that. Thanks so much for coming on and letting us know all about it. To get your own copy of the Book of Etta, just log on to megellison.com. And you're going to want to stay with us because the self-proclaimed angry therapist is joining us next. We'll be right back.